My dad dropped me at a homeless shelter on Christmas Eve with a garbage bag of clothes, so his new wife wouldn't have to raise another woman's child. When I finally asked him why he never came back, he looked away and said, "You were complicated. James was simple." I just stared at him. That was 17 years ago. Last week he collapsed on the shelter floor serving breakfast next to the same bench he left me on. I was 12 when my dad dropped me off at the homeless shelter on Christmas Eve. Not because we were poor, and not because he couldn't take care of me, but because his new wife didn't want another woman's child in her perfect house. The drive there was silent except for the Christmas music on the radio. I kept thinking he'd turn around. Maybe this was just to scare me into being better behaved around Sharon. But then we pulled up to this gray building with a line of people outside waiting in the cold. He turned to me and said, "This is temporary. Just until Sharon adjusts to the idea of you living with us. I'll always provide for you. You're my responsibility." I believed him. Even when he handed me a garbage bag with my clothes. Even when the shelter worker looked at him with complete disgust. Even when he drove away without looking back. For 3 weeks I told everyone my dad was coming back. The other kids at the shelter had heard it all before, but I was different. My dad had promised. Week 4 came and went. Then month 2. The shelter had a phone, and I called his cell every day until the number got disconnected. Called his office until his secretary said I wasn't on the list of approved callers anymore. Sharon had given birth to their real child, a boy they named James. I found out through Facebook on the shelter's computer. The announcement said, "Our first child has arrived," like I'd never existed. But I still waited. On my 13th birthday, I sat by the shelter entrance all day. Nothing. Child services tried to place me in foster homes, but I kept running back to that shelter. What if he came looking and I wasn't there? The shelter workers started calling me Ghost because I'd disappear from foster placements and reappear at their door. It took 8 months before I finally understood. He wasn't adjusting to anything. He'd thrown me away like trash and started over with his new family. That's when I stopped being a kid. The streets taught you fast or they killed you. I learned which restaurants threw out fresh food at closing, which libraries let you stay all day if you were reading, which churches had unlocked bathrooms where you could wash up. Started hanging around the university library, and when students left their textbooks behind, I'd read them cover to cover. Chemistry, biology, anatomy. The librarian noticed me eventually. Mrs. Smith. She never said anything about my situation, but started leaving sandwiches on the desk where I studied. When I turned 16, I lied about my age and got a job washing dishes. Saved every penny. Slept in a storage unit I rented for $50 a month. It was illegal but cheaper than any apartment. I studied for my GED between shifts. The other dishwashers thought I was weird reading medical textbooks while scrubbing pots, but I had a plan. Sharon had stolen my father, but she wasn't stealing my future. Passed my GED with perfect scores. Got into community college, then transferred to State University. Pre-med. Full scholarships because my essays about homelessness made admissions committees cry. Medical school was harder. Not academically, but explaining gaps in my history. Why no family at graduation? Why my emergency contact was a librarian. I never mentioned my father. Listed him as deceased on applications. Easier than explaining the truth. 36-hour shifts on 4 hours sleep, but I'd slept in worse conditions. The other residents complained about the hospital cots being uncomfortable. I wanted to laugh. They had no idea what uncomfortable meant. Try sleeping on concrete in January. But I kept my mouth shut and worked harder than everyone. My attending physicians loved me because I never complained. Never had family emergencies. I specialized in nephrology. I bought a house. A real house with heat that always worked and a bed that didn't smell like other people's misery. Then I met Anna at a medical conference. Smart and beautiful and laughed at my terrible medical puns. We had a daughter. I built everything from nothing. Without him, without any of them. That's when my phone rang. Unknown number but local area code. Almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Dr. Brian Williams?" The voice was professional. Tired. "Yes. This is Dr. Poe at Mercy General. Your father listed you as his emergency contact. He's in acute kidney failure. We need to discuss treatment options." I hung up, blocked the number, but they called from different lines. Eventually Anna answered and they told her everything. How he needed a transplant. How his son was a doctor. How I was the only family match they could find because his other child James was only 14 and Sharon had diabetes. "You should at least hear them out," Anna said that night. She didn't know the whole truth, just that we were estranged. So I went, walked into that hospital room and saw him for the first time in 17 years. By morning, my phone started buzzing on the nightstand at 6:30 and didn't stop for an hour. Sharon's number first, then Richard's, then some local number I didn't know. I let them all go to voicemail while I made coffee and watched the missed calls pile up. Anna had already left for her early shift, so I sat alone at the kitchen table scrolling through the notifications. 12 calls total before a text popped up from Sharon's number saying James wanted to meet his brother and that he hadn't known I existed until yesterday. I played Richard's voicemail while staring at my medical degree on the wall. His voice sounded weak and desperate as he said he knew he'd failed me and that he was weak and cowardly, but James was innocent in all this. He kept saying if I wouldn't help him, then at least I should meet James and let him know his brother. The manipulation was so obvious it made me want to throw the phone, but something shifted when I thought about that 14-year-old kid who just found out his whole family history was built on lies. 3 days passed before I finally texted back saying I'd meet James at a coffee shop downtown. He was already there when I walked in, and seeing him felt like looking at myself from 17 years ago, with the same dark eyes and same nervous habit of tapping his fingers on the table. He looked up when I sat down and said quietly that Mom and Dad told him I died, and that's what he'd believed his whole life until yesterday, when he found out I was alive and Dad needed my kidney. His voice turned bitter as he continued saying they told him I was troubled and chose to leave, but he'd found the shelter records online last night showing December 24th intake for Brian Williams, age 12, dropped off by father with a note saying child was abandoned and father cited new marriage. I realized he'd been up all night researching and trying to understand what really happened. He slid a folder across the table filled with printouts of my academic achievements and medical school graduation and published papers. His voice cracked when he said I became a doctor after living on the streets and built everything from nothing while he had everything handed to him because Dad threw me away for their family. We sat there for 2 hours while he asked questions about those years, and I gave him honest answers about sleeping in libraries and eating from dumpsters and studying by streetlight. 3 days later, I found myself at the hospital meeting with the transplant coordinator for initial testing, even though I hadn't committed to anything yet. The woman explained the whole process, including psychological evaluation and physical tests, and weeks of preparation if I got approved, while emphasizing that living donors needed to be certain with no coercion allowed. That evening, Mrs. Smith called me, and her warm, familiar voice brought back memories of those sandwiches she'd leave on my study desk. She said she'd heard through the hospital grapevine about my father, and that whatever I decided, she was proud of me, and that I was always too good for the family that threw me away. I remembered her quiet protection during my darkest years, and how she never asked questions but always made sure I had food. The next day, I went back to Richard's hospital room, and Sharon was there waiting. She stood up when I walked in, and immediately started saying saying I was enjoying this and having power over them. Richard tried to quiet her, but she kept going, saying they gave James everything, including private schools and college fund and opportunities, and asking what I ever did to deserve their help back then. I kept my voice calm, even though my hands were shaking when I responded that I was 12 years old, and my mother had died, and my father chose his new wife over his son, and I didn't need to deserve basic parental care, because that was their legal and moral obligation. A nurse walked in right then, clearly sensing the tension in the room. She checked Richard's vitals while we all stood there silent and made notes about his declining numbers on her chart. After she left, Richard finally spoke up, saying the business failed 3 years ago and they lost everything, including the house and savings and investments. He said Sharon's medical bills from her diabetes complications drained what was left, and James's college fund was gone. I stood there looking at this broken man who used to be my father, while Sharon stared at the floor, and James kept checking his phone every few seconds. The room felt smaller with all of us in it, and I noticed Sharon's hands shaking as she gripped her purse. Richard started coughing again and reached for the water pitcher, but his hand missed and knocked it to the floor. Water spread across the tiles, and Sharon jumped back while James grabbed paper towels from the bathroom. I watched them clean up the mess without helping because my feet felt frozen to that spot by the door. A week later, I sat at the playground watching my daughter climb the monkey bars while Anna pushed her on the swings. Why does Sharon keep bringing up what they gave James when she's the one who made Richard abandon his first kid? The timing of Richard's business failing right when he needs help feels awfully convenient. I wonder if there's more to that story than he's telling. Anna turned to me between pushes and said if I donated and something happened during surgery, our daughter would lose her father. She asked if his life was worth that risk, and I watched our little girl laughing as she went higher. The statistics said donation was safe, but Anna worked in medicine too and knew no surgery came without risks. My phone kept buzzing with texts from James all week asking about medical school and how I built my life from nothing. He wanted to know about forgiveness and kept saying he felt lost, learning his whole childhood was built on my suffering. The kid was having an identity crisis and texting me at all hours like I had answers he needed. I drove to Marcus's office 3 days later and sat in the same chair where I'd cried about residency stress years ago. Marcus listened while I explained everything about Richard needing a kidney and being a perfect match. He leaned back in his chair and said in all his years of medicine he'd never seen someone with such a clear chance for justified refusal. He asked who I wanted to be instead of what Richard deserved, and I stared at the diplomas on his wall. I told Marcus I kept thinking about that shelter and how I promised myself I'd become someone who helps people, but I also promised I'd never let Richard hurt me again, and both promises mattered to me. Marcus nodded and said both promises mattered, but the question was, which one defined me more as a person? 2 weeks after that first contact, the transplant coordinator called saying I was a perfect match and ideal candidate for donation. She said Richard's condition was getting worse, and they needed a decision within the week before it was too late. I hung up and walked to my car where I found Sharon waiting in the parking lot with James in the passenger seat. Sharon got out when she saw me, and her desperation showed in how she moved toward me too quickly. She said we needed to talk about James's future because if Richard died, she couldn't afford to keep James in school. They'd lose the house, and she knew I had money now and success, so maybe I could help my brother. I saw James shrink down in the passenger seat, looking ashamed of his mother begging me for money like this. I asked Sharon if she wanted me to pay for the life she stole from me all those years ago. Her mask finally cracked, and she said she never wanted me gone permanently, just until things settled down. She claimed Richard made that choice on his own, and she tried to change his mind, but he wouldn't listen. James got out of the car and told his mom to stop, just stop, because she was making everything worse. I found James crying in the hospital corridor later that same day, in the exact hallway where I first saw Richard. He looked up at me with red eyes and said he hated them both for what they did to me. He said they destroyed me to build their family, and now wanted me to save it after everything. He wouldn't blame me if I walked away and never looked back at any of them, including him. I sat down beside James on that cold hospital floor, remembering what being 14 and alone felt like all those years ago. I told him neither of us were responsible for their choices, and he wasn't defined by what they did. James looked at me and asked if I was considering the donation anyway, even after everything they put me through. I didn't answer, but he saw the truth in my silence and shook his head like he couldn't believe it. 3 days later, Anna found the donor surgery scheduling papers I'd hidden in my desk drawer at home. She held them up with shaking hands and asked if I'd already decided to save the man who threw me away. Her voice broke when she asked what that would teach our daughter about her worth if I saved him. The words hung between us like broken glass, and I could see the fight building in her eyes as she gripped those papers harder. I took a step toward her, but she backed away, shaking her head, and that's when I heard myself saying something about choosing to be better than the people who hurt us. Anna's face went hard, and she said something about abusers getting rewarded if they wait long enough, about abandoning a child having no permanent consequences, and that's when our daughter appeared in the doorway. Her small face looked confused and scared, watching us stand there with all that anger between us, and Anna immediately dropped the papers on the counter and went to her. I followed them to her bedroom where Anna tucked her in while I stood in the doorway feeling like the worst father in the world. After Anna left, I sat on the edge of our daughter's bed and she grabbed my hand with her tiny fingers and asked why mommy was sad. I tried to find words that would make sense to a 5-year-old, but all I could think about was being 12 and not understanding why I wasn't worth keeping. I told her sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices, and she nodded like she understood, but I knew she couldn't, and I stayed there until she fell asleep. The next morning, I drove to the hospital for my final evaluation, and Dr. Patel, Richard's surgeon, spread my test results across his desk like evidence. He told me I was incredibly healthy, an ideal donor candidate, but then he leaned forward and asked if I was being coerced, said the psychological evaluation had flagged some concerns about family dynamics, and he needed to know the truth. I sat there knowing I could end this whole thing with one word. Just tell him the truth about Richard abandoning me, about the pressure, and I'd be disqualified immediately. Instead, I lied and said no coercion, that it was complicated but my choice. Dr. Patel studied me for a long moment, then explained that donation was irreversible, that once my kidney was gone, I couldn't get it back if I regretted the decision. I thought about all the irreversible choices Richard made 17 years ago, but just nodded and signed the consent forms. After the appointment, I went to Richard's room and found him looking worse than before. His skin had this grayish tint, and his breathing sounded labored even with the oxygen. Sharon sat beside him holding his hand, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent lights, and Richard told me the dialysis wasn't working as well anymore. Dr. Poe had given him maybe 3 months without a transplant, and I could see the fear in his eyes. Real fear, not the fake concern he'd shown when asking for my kidney. Then he said he needed to tell me something, and I knew what was coming before the words left his mouth. He told me he'd sat in the shelter parking lot for 2 hours after dropping me off, that he'd almost come back, and my chest got so tight I thought I might pass out. I managed to say that he didn't come back though, and he nodded, said Sharon had threatened to leave and take James if he brought me home, that he was a coward who chose the easy family over the complicated one. The words hit me like punches, and and I heard myself saying I was never complicated, just a grieving 12-year-old who'd lost his mother, that I needed a father, not a shelter, needed him to fight for me the way I was expected to fight for him now. Sharon started crying, but I didn't care, couldn't care, because 17 years of pain was pouring out of me in that hospital room. A week before the scheduled surgery, I came home from work to find James sitting on my front porch with a backpack at his feet. He stood up when he saw me and said he'd left, told his parents he was staying with a friend, but couldn't be there anymore, watching them manipulate me. Anna came to the door, and I saw her looking between us, seeing the family resemblance in our faces, the same nose, the same jawline. We brought him inside, and over dinner he started telling stories about growing up in that perfect house, about Richard always being at work, about Sharon's need to control everything, about the perfect family facade that hid all the dysfunction underneath. He pushed his food around his plate and admitted he'd always wished for a sibling, someone who'd understand what it was like, then looked at me and said he'd had one all along, living on the streets because of them. Anna reached across the table and squeezed his hand while I sat there trying to process this kid who was my brother, but a stranger, who'd had everything I'd wanted but still ended up damaged. That night I couldn't sleep, just lay there at 3 in the morning with the surgery 5 days away, touching the side where they'd remove my kidney and imagining the void it would leave. Anna slept beside me, her back turned, but I knew she was awake too, could tell by her breathing, and the weight of this choice felt heavier than any night I'd spent on the streets. The next morning I drove to Mrs. Smith's place without telling Anna where I was going. She lived in a small apartment near the university now, retired but still surrounded by books, and when she opened the door she just nodded like she'd been expecting me. Her living room had photos everywhere from her library days, and I saw one of teenage me hunched over a chemistry textbook at my usual corner desk. She poured tea and sat across from me and said simply that I'd saved myself. She'd just provided sandwiches. Don't confuse kindness with salvation. Then she looked straight at me and said, Richard didn't deserve my kidney. But this wasn't about him, was it? This was about that 12-year-old boy who promised himself he'd never become the kind of person who abandoned someone in need. She understood me better than anyone ever had. 3 days before surgery, Sharon showed up at my office with a stack of papers, legal documents she wanted me to sign, guarantees I wouldn't seek money later or claim inheritance rights. I actually laughed at that, told her she was still trying to erase me from the family even as I saved it. She pushed the papers at me harder, so I grabbed them and tore them in half right there in front of her, then told her no contracts. I do this on my terms or not at all, and if I die on that operating table, Anna gets to tell the world exactly who you both are. There's something really strange about Sharon showing up with legal papers while begging for Brian's kidney. She wants to erase him from the family even as she needs him to save it. Her face went white and she backed toward the door, realizing she had no power here. That afternoon my phone rang and it was James, his voice shaking, saying Dad had collapsed and they were rushing him to emergency surgery, something about fluid in his lungs. I drove to the hospital fast, found chaos in the ICU with nurses running everywhere and machines beeping. Dr. Poe pulled me aside and explained Richard's body was shutting down faster than expected and we might not have time for the transplant. They got him stable but barely, machines doing most of his breathing, and Dr. Poe said if he stayed stable we had a narrow window, but we'd need to move the surgery up to tomorrow morning. I hadn't finished getting my affairs in order, hadn't prepared mentally for tomorrow instead of 3 days from now, but there wasn't a choice. Anna arrived with our daughter who ran straight to me and wrapped her arms around my waist. Anna just said we're a team. If you're doing this tomorrow, we're here tonight. Sharon stood in the corner watching us, seeing the family I'd built, the love and support and loyalty she'd never offered anyone. The surgical team started prepping everything for a 5 a.m. start time. James found me signing the final consent forms and hugged me tight, said I was the brother he always needed even when he didn't know I existed. They wheeled me toward surgery on one gurney while they wheeled Richard on another, and he reached out with his hand, whispered he was sorry for all of it. I looked at the man who destroyed my childhood and told him I know, but this doesn't make us even, doesn't make us family. This makes me the man you never were. The operating room was cold and bright, and they put the mask over my face telling me to count backward from 10. My last thought before the darkness took me was that I was saving the life of someone who wouldn't save mine. The ultimate proof that Richard's abandonment hadn't broken the goodness inside me. 6 hours later, I opened my eyes to see Anna's face above me, everything blurry, but I could make out her smile as she squeezed my hand and whispered that both surgeries went perfect. The pain in my side felt like someone had taken a hot knife to my ribs, but the morphine made it bearable, and through the window I could see James sitting in the hallway staring at the floor. The next morning, Dr. Patel came in to check my incisions and told me everything looked textbook perfect, while explaining that my kidney was already making urine in Richard's body, and his numbers were getting better every hour. I felt weird knowing part of me was inside him now, not just the physical emptiness where my kidney used to be, but something deeper that I couldn't put into words. 2 days after surgery, Mrs. Smith showed up with a photo album instead of her usual sandwiches, and started showing me pictures she'd secretly taken over the years of me studying in the library, graduating high school, getting into medical school, becoming a doctor. She said I needed to see how amazing I was with or without them, and I flipped through page after page of my life documented by someone who cared when my own family didn't. The door opened and Sharon walked in without knocking, looking smaller somehow, maybe humbled, and said Richard was asking for me and that he was stable enough for visitors now. James appeared behind her and asked me to please come because he thought Richard needed to say real things this time, not the fake apologies from before. I didn't want to go, but Anna helped me into a wheelchair, and we went down the hall to Richard's room where he looked better already with color back in his face. He started talking about how my kidney was working perfectly, how part of me was keeping him alive, and the weight of that sat between us like a physical thing. Then he said he needed to tell me about that night after he left me at the shelter, how Sharon and him fought for hours because she said it was me or them, and he chose them but threw up in the parking lot knowing what he'd done. I sat there listening to words that were 17 years too late while he kept talking about how every Christmas since then he'd driven by that shelter wondering if I was still there, or if I was even alive but was too scared to actually check. I finally told him I was there for 8 months, and he could have found me anytime he wanted if he'd actually tried. 5 days after surgery, Anna drove me home, and I moved real slow up the stairs while my daughter carefully hugged my good side, and the house felt different somehow, like I was the same person, but changed by what I'd given away. I kept touching my side throughout the day, feeling where the kidney used to be, like when people say they can still feel a missing arm or leg, and Anna caught me doing it and asked if I had regrets. I told her it wasn't regret exactly, just this weird awareness that part of me lived in him now, and it felt strange knowing that. James started texting me constantly with updates about Richard getting better, but also asking deeper questions about identity and family, and how you forgive someone who did terrible things to you. I texted back that you don't reconcile loving someone who hurt you. You just decide what you can live with and what you can't. 2 weeks after the surgery, I went back to work, even though Anna kept telling me to rest more, but I needed to get back to normal life. My first day back, I was doing rounds in the cardiac unit when suddenly this sharp pain pain shot through my side, and I grabbed the wall to steady myself. The room started spinning, and my vision went blurry, and the next thing I knew, I was on the floor with nurses crowding around me. They got me on a gurney and rushed me down to emergency, where they ran blood tests and scans, and found an infection at the surgical site that needed immediate treatment. Anna showed up within minutes, and she was mad, really mad, saying I pushed too hard to save him, and now I was risking myself. They admitted me and started IV antibiotics, and from my hospital bed, I could see down the hall where Richard was doing physical therapy, walking slowly with a walker, but walking because my kidney was working in him. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was getting stronger while I was lying there fighting an infection from saving him. James kept going back and forth between our rooms, bringing me water, then checking on Richard, then coming back to sit with me looking confused and torn about everything. 3 days into my hospital stay, Sharon showed up alone and closed the door behind her and sat down in the visitor chair. She looked different, older maybe, or just tired, and she started talking without any small talk. She told me she'd been jealous of a 12-year-old child because Richard loved my mother in a way he never loved her. She said I was the reminder of that love, and she made him choose, and we'd all paid for it since. Then she dropped this bomb that James wasn't even biologically hers because she couldn't have children, and they used a donor egg, but Richard never treated James differently. She said the way Richard treated me was her influence, her insecurity, and she was the monster in this story. I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at the ceiling while she cried. My infection got worse over the next 2 days, and they had to take me back to surgery to clean the site and drain the abscess that had formed. As they were prepping me, Richard showed up in a wheelchair, still weak but mobile, and told me not to dare die saving him because that wasn't the ending any of us deserved. I actually laughed at that and said we rarely get what we deserve. The surgery went fine, but my recovery was slower than expected, and the transplant team kept running tests to check if my remaining kidney was handling the workload. A month after the donation, both Richard and I were still in the hospital, him getting stronger every day while I dealt with complications and slower healing. Anna brought our daughter to visit, but she was scared of all the machines and the smell, and wouldn't come near the bed at first. I saw myself at 12 in her eyes, terrified and alone, and I pulled her close and told her I would never ever leave her, that no matter what happened, she would always be my whole world. The test results finally came back, showing my remaining kidney was working harder, but functioning well enough, though Dr. Patel explained I'd need monitoring for life, and any sign of problems meant immediate intervention. The reality hit me that I was forever changed, forever vulnerable because of this choice I'd made. Richard got discharged a few days later, and he stopped by my room on his way out, my kidney keeping him alive and healthy while I still had drains and IV lines. He said he was going to therapy, real therapy, to understand how he became someone who could abandon his child, and I just nodded but didn't offer anything more. James decided to stay with me and Anna temporarily because he couldn't go back to Sharon and Richard yet, and he asked if it was wrong that he hated them for what they did to me, even though they raised him. I told him feelings aren't wrong, that actions matter, to feel what he feels then choose who he wants to be. 6 weeks after the surgery, I was sorting mail when I found the thick envelope from a law firm. The letter inside said Richard and Sharon were getting divorced, and Sharon's lawyer wanted me to testify about Richard abandoning me. Anna read it over my shoulder and her hands started shaking. She grabbed the letter and threw it in the trash, then pulled it back out and read it again. I called the lawyer's office and made an appointment for the next day. The lawyer's office was in a tall building downtown with leather chairs and dark wood everywhere. She explained that Sharon needed proof Richard was an unfit parent to get full custody of James. She wanted me to tell the court how he left me at that shelter and never came back. Sharon suddenly wants custody of James after all this mess she created. She pushed Richard to abandon me but now claims he's unfit. Something feels really off about her timing here, showing up with divorce papers right when Richard's recovering from getting my kidney. She had a whole file about me with newspaper articles about my homelessness and medical school graduation. I realized my kidney donation made everything complicated because saving Richard's life made it harder to prove he was completely bad. When I got home, James was waiting on our porch with red eyes and his backpack. He'd heard about the divorce from Sharon and kept saying he caused all this by finding me. He was crying so hard he could barely breathe. I told him Richard and Sharon made their choices 17 years ago, and he was just another person hurt by what they did. 3 days later, Richard showed up at my office while I was reviewing patient charts. Security called to say my father was in the lobby demanding to see me. I went down and found him pacing near the elevators. He looked healthier than before the surgery, but his eyes were desperate. He started talking fast about how Sharon was trying to take James away and use my past against him. He kept saying I couldn't let her weaponize what happened between us. I looked at this man, my kidney was keeping alive, and asked if he meant like how he weaponized James to get my kidney. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He turned and left without saying anything else. The court date came 2 weeks later. I sat outside the courtroom watching lawyers rush past with their rolling briefcases. When they called my name, I walked in and told the judge I wouldn't testify for either parent. I said James was old enough to pick where he wanted to live. The judge, an older woman with gray hair, agreed and said she'd talk to James privately. James went into her office for almost an hour while we all waited in the hallway. Sharon kept checking her phone and Richard stared at the floor. When James came out, he looked straight at me. The judge called us all back in and announced James had requested emancipation with me as his guardian. She said he wanted to finish high school living with people who showed real love. Sharon's face went white and Richard's hands started shaking, but neither of them said anything. The paperwork took another month to process. 2 months after the surgery, my kidney function tests came back perfect, and I went back to full-time work. My patients never knew what I'd been through, but I understood their fears better now. I knew what it meant to give up part of yourself for someone else. Mrs. Smith called one night and invited our whole family for dinner at her apartment. She'd made enough food for 20 people even though it was just me, Anna, our daughter, and James. After dinner, she pulled me aside in her kitchen while everyone else was looking at her photo albums. She put her hand on my arm and said the shelter couldn't break me, and the streets couldn't break me. She said giving Richard my kidney didn't break me either. Her eyes were wet when she hugged me. Richard started sending checks every month for James's expenses. I put them all in a college account without telling James. There was never any other contact, just the checks arriving like clockwork. Sharon moved to Texas to live with her sister, and her calls to James went from daily to weekly to almost nothing. One evening, I found James on the couch looking at Facebook on his laptop. He was staring at old photos of the Williams family from before I existed. There was Richard young and smiling with his first wife, my mom, at their wedding. There was a picture of them holding me as a baby. James asked if I wished things had been different. I sat next to him and thought about it. I told him I wished they'd been different people, but then he wouldn't exist, and that would be the real tragedy. 3 months later, my phone rang at 2 in the morning, and I knew before answering that something was wrong. Dr. Poe's voice was tired when she explained Richard's body was rejecting the kidney, and they needed me at the hospital immediately. I drove through empty streets while Anna stayed home with our daughter, and when I walked into Richard's room, his skin had that gray color I'd seen too many times in my career. The monitor showed his numbers dropping, and the nurses moved around around him, adjusting IV lines and checking vitals every few minutes. Richard looked up at me from the bed and made a weak joke about even my kidney wanting nothing to do with him, which would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. I told him the kidney kept him alive long enough to see who he really was, and maybe that was enough. The nephrologist on duty increased his anti-rejection medications, and over the next 48 hours we watched the numbers slowly improve while I stayed in that hospital room, remembering all the nights I'd spent alone in emergency rooms as a kid with no one to call. The drugs worked and Richard stabilized, but we both understood now that this connection between us would last forever, because every crisis of his would pull me back, no matter how much I wanted to stay away. 2 weeks later, Anna found me in our home office, surrounded by my old medical textbooks from the storage unit days with pages yellow and worn from years of studying by flashlight. She picked up one of the anatomy books and saw my notes in the margins written in pencil when I was 17 and sleeping in that storage unit. She said I was looking for answers that weren't in those books because medical texts couldn't explain why people abandon their children or why others save the ones who hurt them. 6 months after the surgery, James graduated high school with honors, and Anna and I sat in the front row watching him walk across that stage in his cap and gown. Richard showed up and stood in the back alone without Sharon, who'd filed for divorce after learning the whole truth about what happened to me. After the ceremony, James hugged me first and held on tight before walking over to Richard, who stood there looking small and old. James thanked him for coming, but said clearly that I was his family now, and Richard just nodded and said he understood because he'd lost the right to call himself anyone's father when he proved fathers could throw away their children. He said I'd proved they could also save them even when they shouldn't have to, and James nodded and walked back to us. That evening at the graduation dinner, James told us he was going pre-med at State University just like I had and wanted to help people heal the way I'd helped him heal from learning about our family. I saw myself in his determination, but his came from love instead of abandonment, and that made all the difference. Later, Anna and I watched our daughter playing with James in the backyard, and she said I'd given Richard a kidney, but I'd given James a life, and that was the real donation that mattered. The months passed, and at my one-year checkup, Dr. Patel ran all the tests and said my remaining kidney was working perfectly, and most donors lived completely normal lives without anyone knowing they'd given away an organ except for the scar. I touched my side where the incision had healed into a thin line, and told her some scars were important to remember. On the exact anniversary of the donation, a letter arrived with Richard's handwriting on the envelope, and I almost threw it away, but curiosity made me open it. Inside, he'd written that he woke up every day knowing he was alive because of the son he threw away on Christmas Eve, and there was no redemption for that kind of sin, only the weight of truth he'd carry until the kidney stopped working. I stared at that letter for 3 days before picking up a pen and writing back that the kidney was never about saving him, but about saving me from becoming him, because every day I chose kindness over abandonment, I won, and he was alive to witness the man I became despite him. Mailed it and felt something shift inside me like a weight lifting off my chest. 2 weeks later, James called to say he got into college with a full scholarship after writing an essay about discovering his brother's story through old court documents. His graduation party was at our house with Mrs. Smith sitting on the couch, watching James laugh with his friends, when she pulled me aside and told me that boy was my greatest victory, because I showed him family isn't about blood, but about choosing to stay. Found myself nodding as James caught my eye across the room and smiled. The next morning, Mrs. Smith handed me an envelope with a photo she'd gotten from the shelter's old security footage, showing 12-year-old me on Christmas sitting with my garbage bag of clothes. Showed it to my daughter that night and explained this was why Daddy never gives up on people, because someone gave up on me once, and I decided to be different. She hugged me tight and said she'd never give up on anyone either. Richard's health stayed stable with the kidney working well on adjusted medications, and Sharon left him after their money ran out from medical bills. James moved in with us permanently. Ran into Richard at the grocery store 6 months later, where he told me he volunteers at the homeless shelter now serving breakfast every morning, trying to balance scales he knows he can never balance. Just nodded and walked away. 18 months after the surgery, I spoke at a medical conference about organ donation without naming Richard, but telling my story, and concluded that we don't donate to save the deserving, but to save ourselves from becoming people who could walk away from suffering. The room went silent, then erupted in applause. After the conference, a young resident approached me saying she was abandoned too, and aged out of foster care and made it through medical school on loans, and asked how I forgive. Told her you don't forgive, but you build something better from the broken pieces, because forgiveness is optional, but moving forward isn't. She thanked me with tears in her eyes. James started medical school the following year, choosing nephrology as his specialty, and told me he wanted to understand the organ that connects us all, because it was the kidney I gave, and the disease that revealed truth, and the medicine that brought us together. Richard's showing up at the homeless shelter every morning to serve breakfast feels like he's trying to buy forgiveness with volunteer hours, but you can't fix throwing away your kid by scrambling eggs for strangers, though I wonder if he sees his younger self in their faces now. Watched him put on his white coat for the first time and felt proud. My daughter asked about the grandfather she'd never met properly one evening at dinner. Explained simply that sometimes people make choices that hurt others, and we can't control that, but we can control whether we repeat their mistakes or learn from them. She understood more than I expected. Mrs. S. Smith passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years later. At her funeral, I spoke about kindness without conditions and sandwiches that saved a life, and the librarian who taught me that family is built not just born. Her legacy lives in every patient I save, and every moment James chooses compassion over convenience. Now I stand in my office looking at 3 photos on my desk, showing 12-year-old me at the shelter and my family with Anna and our daughter and James in his white coat. My phone rings with Richard's name on the screen, probably calling about kidney concerns. I answer because that's who I chose to become. Someone who answers when people need help, even when they never answered for me. Well, folks, what a ride. Appreciate you letting me tag along with all these thoughts and questions. Always more fun wondering together. Catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.